The relationship between the US and Iran, it's one of the most hostile and complicated on the world stage. But what if I told you this animosity isn't ancient history? It was actually born from a single, specific moment of betrayal. We're going to dig into how a really close alliance completely fell apart, and why that one event still defines the conflict we see today. Okay, picture this. It's 1979. A country that just a minute ago was one of America's best friends in the Middle East is suddenly on fire with revolution. And the chant you hear echoing through the streets of Tehran, Mort à l'Amérique, death to America. I mean, for people watching in the West, this was absolutely shocking. How did this happen? So yeah, how did this happen? How does a strategic partnership just collapse into this kind of raw hatred? Well, the answer isn't simple, and it sure didn't happen overnight. To really, truly get it, we have to rewind the clock 26 years to a secret operation that was all about one thing: oil. It is so hard to imagine now, but back in the early 1950s, the US and Iran were partners. For Washington, Iran was this critical wall against the Soviet Union. And for Tehran, America looked like a great alternative to the old colonial bullies, Britain and Russia, who'd been eyeing their resources for decades. But this whole alliance, it was built on some seriously shaky ground. And this right here, this is the shaky ground. Just look at how lopsided this is. At the time, all of Iran's oil was controlled by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was basically the British government. And the deal they had was so bad that, get this, Iran's royalties over 50 years were less than the company's profits in the single year of 1950. This wasn't just a bad business deal. For Iranians, it was a national humiliation. And all that anger and humiliation brought this man to power, Mohammad Mossadegh. He was this incredibly charismatic nationalist, elected prime minister in 1951 on one simple, powerful promise: Iran's oil should belong to Iranians. And he actually did it. He nationalized the entire industry. In Tehran, people were celebrating in the streets. In London, well, they saw it as a declaration of war. And that brings us to what a lot of historians call the original sin of the US-Iran relationship. Britain was furious. They organized a global boycott of Iranian oil and then ran to Washington for help, whispering that if Iran's economy failed, it would fall right into the hands of the Soviets. The result was a secret operation that would leave a scar that has never, ever healed. The plan was called Operation Ajax, and it was a joint venture between the CIA and Britain's MI6. The goal was brutally simple: get rid of the democratically elected Mossadegh and put the young monarch Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi back on the throne with absolute power. Why? Because he was seen as much more, let's just say, cooperative. To make this happen, the CIA put $1 million on the table, which was an absolute fortune back then. The man they put in charge was none other than Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt, and his mission was basically to tear the country apart from the inside out. So how'd they do it? Well, the CIA had this 4-step playbook, and it was a masterclass in destabilization. First, propaganda. They paid off journalists to just plant fake, nasty stories about Mossadegh. Second, bribery. They paid off politicians, military officers, even religious figures to turn against him. Then came the riots, hiring thugs and gangsters to create total chaos in the streets. And the final step? The overthrow. But here's the thing. The coup almost failed. The first attempt on August 15th was a total disaster. The Shah actually panicked and fled to Rome. It looked like the whole plan had backfired. But Roosevelt, he didn't give up. On August 19th, he launched a second attempt. Paid pro-Shah mobs, backed by tanks, stormed government buildings. They shelled Mossadegh's home, and after a battle that left nearly 300 people dead, the prime minister was arrested. The coup had succeeded. So, with Mossadegh in prison, the Shah came back to Iran. But he wasn't just a king anymore. He was now an absolute dictator who owed his throne, lock, stock, and barrel, to Washington and London. And for the next 25 years, he would be America's gendarme of the Gulf. Basically, its armed sheriff, supplied with the best US weapons to keep the Soviets out. And this really shows you the two faces of his rule. On one hand, he did launch this white revolution, a crash course in modernization, with things like land reform and giving women the right to vote. But hiding behind that shiny, progressive image was a brutal dictatorship. Any kind of dissent was ruthlessly crushed by his secret police, the infamous Savak, And guess who helped him set that up in 1957? Yep, the CIA. The Savak's reign of terror created this deep well of anger across the country. And eventually, a voice for that anger emerged from exile, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He was a religious leader the Shah had banished back in 1964. And from afar, he just hammered the Shah for his corruption and for being a puppet of the United States, which Khomeini famously called the Great Satan. And his sermons, smuggled into Iran on, of all things, cassette tapes, inspired millions and brought together this powerful, unlikely alliance of opponents. By late 1977, you could feel the ground starting to shake. The cracks in the Shah's regime were showing. Protests started popping up everywhere. And then, an insult to Khomeini, published in a state-run newspaper in January 1978, well, that turned out to be the spark that lit the whole country on fire. It just kicked off this vicious cycle. Protests would lead to bloody crackdowns, and those crackdowns would just fuel even bigger, angrier protests. The real turning point came in September 1978, on what's now known as Black Friday, when the army gunned down hundreds of peaceful protesters in Tehran. After that, there was no going back. The country was paralyzed by strikes. By January 1979, the Shah, sick with cancer and totally alone, fled Iran for good. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returned to a hero's welcome. The Islamic Republic was born. But the final, total break with America hadn't happened yet. For the revolutionaries, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran wasn't some neutral diplomatic building. Oh no. To them, it was this, a nest of spies. It was the very place, the headquarters, from which the 1953 coup had been planned and executed. So on November 4th, 1979, radical students swarmed the walls and stormed the embassy, taking 52 Americans hostage. They demanded the U.S. send back the Shah, who was getting cancer treatment in a New York hospital. Ayatollah Khomeini gave the takeover his blessing, calling it a second revolution. That crisis dragged on for an agonizing 444 days. It completely destroyed what was left of diplomatic ties and cemented this bitter, ideological hatred that is still with us today. So, when you step back and look at the whole story, from the coup in '53 all the way to the hostage crisis in '79, what you're really seeing is a tragedy in 2 acts. These 2 events are not separate moments in history. They are directly and deeply connected, like a set of dominoes. Just think about it. In 1953, the CIA orchestrates the overthrow of Iran's democracy. And where was the command center for that operation? The U.S. Embassy in Tehran. And then, almost exactly 26 years later, that very same embassy is overrun by revolutionaries. For so many Iranians, this wasn't just a political move. This was perfect, symbolic revenge for the deep humiliation of 1953. And this really just lays out the devastating chain reaction step by step. A U.S. intervention, all about oil, creates a dictator. That dictator's brutal rule then fuels a massive popular revolution. And that revolution, in turn, installs a radical regime whose entire identity is built on opposing the very country that started this whole mess. This history of intervention and blowback, it's the bedrock of the Cold War that still exists between Washington and Tehran. Which leaves us with one last massive question. After all these decades of conflict, from proxy wars to nuclear deals, is that cycle of unintended consequences finally over? Or are we all still living in the shadow of what happened back in August of 1953?